Hello and welcome to Lecture 4 in the Docent Architectural Lecture Series from Victoria Mansion. And today we're going to be focusing on Mr. Morse's library. Now in past lectures, I tried to indicate this whole idea of this sort of cat's cradle of connectedness between what was happening in Europe, Britain and the United States. And we saw these various characters and events over the course of our lectures. And today we're going to be reconnecting ourselves with Andrew Jackson Davis and Andrew Jackson Downing, both of whom were sort of mentors for Henry Austen, the architect of Victoria Mansion, and he actually apprenticed with them. And we're going to see again the connection with the great exhibition of London, Crystal Palace in 1851, which we talked about a lot in the Turkish smoking room. And we're going to see today the influence of the Great Exhibition of New York 2 years later in 1853. And we will also meet a new character in this wonderful cast of characters that have been connected with how and why the Victoria Mansion came into being in the way that it is. And that would be A.W.N. Pugin. So I'd mentioned before the great influence of the exhibition of London, Crystal Palace in 1851, which was sponsored by Prince Albert, the consort to Queen Victoria. And it was really a showcase to demonstrate the power of the great British Empire in technology, art, etc. And it invited lots of exhibits from people around the world, from organizations around the world. It was a huge success and very much was influencing how a lot of information and style techniques and so on came from Europe to the United States. Now, there was a character whose works were presented at the Great Exhibition, who previous to that had actually been very involved in trying to shape the direction of architecture and design in Britain. And that was A.W.N. Pugin, who was an architect, designer, artist, and critic. And he was really one of the most influential drivers of the Gothic revival, even before the Great Exhibition. And what he did was to combine this idealized sense of the medieval past with an intellectual approach to art and design, but also a lot of social consciousness. And one of his famous landmarks still extant to this day is the interior of the Palace of Westminster, Houses of Parliament, that is, and the clock tower that holds Big Ben, the great bell, who sounds out across London. Well, in 1836, Pugin had published a book called Contrasts, or a parallel between architecture of the 15th and 19th century. And it really was his call to a more faith-based social structure that he had sort of extrapolated from the Middle Ages. And he presented in it an entire social program that redefined architecture as a moral force imbued with political and religious meaning, in response to the huge urbanization and growth of industrialization in Victoria, Britain. Now, at Victoria Mansion, the works and the ideas of Pugin have not, I would say, not got a social power or social impact, but they certainly have affected what came to be with the inclusion of Gothic revival in the library at Mr. Morse's mansion. So at the exhibition, Pugin did exhibit a number of his designs and styles and so on. And it's interesting, he in fact actually created a whole range of modestly priced, available to order Gothic style furniture that would come in simple flat packs. And I've put the exclamation point there because it always reminds me of a sort of precursor of IKEA. But there they were, and they were very popular. And below we have an example of one of those flat pack Gothic tables, which is at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And he also designed dinnerware, ceramic garden seats, stained glass, and all sorts of other decorative goods that he hoped would sort of give this other vision, if you like, of a good life in the modern city. The exhibition was hugely successful for Pugin too, and spread the influence of his and notoriety of his work, not only within Britain, but abroad. And that would not have been lost on Andrew Jackson Davis and Andrew Jackson Downing, who collaborated in reshaping in the sort of picturesque, romantic sort of style, American architecture, reviving the Gothic, but also the Italianate style. And Henry Austin, as I mentioned at the beginning, interned or apprenticed with Andrew Jackson Davis, and would have been very much au fait with these developments that were going on in design criteria and priorities within this new field. And Andrew Jackson Downing and Davis both collaborated. And we know that Austin had in his professional library a copy of Downing's Cottage Residences, and very much would have influenced how he approached the Victoria Mansion design as asked for by Ruggles Morse. So in 1853, 2 years after the London Great Exhibition, there was an exhibition of similar magnitude and splendor, also called Crystal Palace, in New York City. The glass and iron structure, a similar structure to the one in London, was covered 175,000 square feet. Its dome was 100 feet in diameter and 148 feet high. And this Crystal Palace was actually built just behind the New York Public Library in Bryant Park, just on West 42nd Street. And it was the largest building in the country at its time, and included over 4,400 exhibitors. Now, unfortunately, it wasn't as financial a success as the London exhibition, but still, it was again another showcase of industrial design, decorative arts, and showcases, if you like, for changes in architectural and design criteria in the United States. Now, Messrs. Benjamin Silliman and Goodrich produced this tome called The World of Science, Art, and Industry, which accompanied the exhibit in 1854. And we'll see that in this, they started to make pronouncements and give their opinions and advice on the very best, not only of industrial design, but also architectural design. And we'll see that their words would have also had an influence on potentially why there is a Gothic revival library at the mansion. And here's a picture from inside the New York Crystal Palace, which looks very similar, in fact, to the design and layout that had been presented 2 years prior in London. So in this book, the authors specifically talked about furniture, and they homed in, interestingly enough, on bookcases. And they have a rather lengthy description about the history of bookcases and how they came into being. And this piece that I've highlighted here, I think, is particularly relevant to our discussion of why there is a Gothic revival style in the library in the Victoria Mansion. And the authors wrote, when they did come into use, the bookcases were constructed upon the Gothic architectural model, which indeed, in its predominance of perpendicular lines, its tendencies to arched paneling, and its union of a general sobriety of effect with the most fanciful richness of detail, is peculiarly suited to rooms devoted to literature, and quite consistent with the safe and convenient arrangements of books in numbers, either great or small. So here was Morse, every single room in his house, as designed by Herter, and all the artwork and so on done by Guidicini, was meticulous in its detail, in its integrated design, as we've seen in every other room that we've discussed. And so here he would also have been wanting to show his knowledge of these finest of design details, but also his seriousness of purpose, his intellect, his bookishness, if you like, that he was not just a man of business, he was a man of letters. And so this idea of tying his book, his library, to the idea of this wonderful Gothic scriptorium, I think would have landed on very, very fertile ground in Morse's mind. And the writers of that wonderful book continue. The bookcases, they were externally little wooden cathedrals, and a look at a print of the west front of Salisbury, York, Peterborough, or Westminster Cathedral will afford a very just idea of their appearance. And here I've given you the west facade, the great western portal of York Minster, and also of Salisbury Cathedral. And we can see the pointed arch that one expects with the Gothic, but also this trio, this tripartite design. And again here, the main portal and the two side portals. Very consistent with the numerology and general geometric styles that really were at the root of the Gothic design in the Middle Ages. And here we have the bookcases in our library at Victoria Mansion. And this was taken from a photograph that was done by the Historic American Business Building Survey, which was just done after 1933. And we can see absolutely the pointed arch, the wonderful regular rows, and then we see these wonderful quatrefoils. And we'll see as we move forward that these ideas, these designs, the trefoils, the quatrefoils, were redolent, were completely really prevalent in Gothic design. And as I said, Silliman and Goodrich really made the link between the medieval libraries and scriptoria that you would have seen in medieval manuscripts and Gothic architecture, and how that marriage of style and shape and design was conducive to a space of study, learning, and reflection. And I've popped in here an image from a manuscript by Jean Le Tavernier, and this is a portrait of the monk scribe Jean Miellot in his workshop, and it was done in 1456. And this is now currently in the National Library in France. But we can see this very studious monk writing away on his manuscript, and the shapes and styles that really were sort of borrowed and incorporated and then refined and applied, not to study in the monkish sense, but to the needs and desires of Morse, who had asked that these designs be included in his house. And then Andrew Jackson Downing also weighed in. He very much drank in these styles that were coming over from Europe, and would have been very attuned to this Gothic revival that was really gaining traction in the United States as well. And in his residence, he wrote, "We would have the ceilings of the drawing room and dining room ribbed. The woodwork should be finished simply and consistently with suitable Gothic moldings, and the whole should be painted and grained in imitation of oak or a black walnut. The effect of the rooms will be still more pleasing if the walls are colored some harmonious neutral tint." Well, in Victoria Mansion, Herta did not design either the dining room or the drawing room in the Gothic style. He put it into the library. It's where he wanted to create that sense of space, of studiousness, quiet study and reflection. And sobriety. This was also a room that wasn't only a library, but also a room where Mr. Morse would conduct some business when he was in Portland during the summer. And as we know, the business associates wouldn't come in through the main house. They would come in through the side door. And it is of note that in this room, these bookcases are not made or grained with black walnut. They actually are made of walnut. And the desk chairs and two side chairs and the table are all made of oak. So very consistent with Downing's prescriptions. And then we'll see that Gustav Hertha, as in every other room in the house, really integrated the theme that was to showcase this room as a Gothic revival space. And it is seen through the bookcases, and we can see here, I've put this little image here of the quatrefoil within the pointed arch of a cathedral. We can see it here incorporated, stylized, and applied in the bookcases. And then we also see the trefoils, even in the paneled door that leads off the office into Mr. Morse's private bathroom, one of only 3 bathrooms in the house. So there is nothing that is random. It is all interconnected and consistent with the theme that Hertha had put in place for this room. We see it again in the chairs. Here we see his desk chair, still in its original leather. And over to the right, one of the 2 side chairs, which has been recovered in leather. And again, we can see the shape here from the cathedral, perfectly sort of reiterated in the backs of these chairs. We have the pointed arch, the centered trefoils, and the tracery that we see here in these windows. Again, too, on the desk. Here is Mr. Morse's desk, and we can see it's just exquisitely done. You've got these beautiful pointed arches with the little trefoils all through here by the drawer fronts. And the legs there aren't just 4 of them, they are set up almost as though they are the piers and pillars and pilasters of a Gothic cathedral. And we can see here that they are designed, again, almost like a Gothic stained glass window with the tracery. And then here in the spandrels, we have these beautiful trefoils again, embraced in a sort of a rounded triangular shape, all of which in medieval times spoke to the sort of mystical numerology, the trio being the Trinity, and so on. But here it's not, of course, ecclesiastical, but rather just a wonderful application of this period of architecture, but just for secular use. And actually, I did climb under the desk, and from this side, you can see again just the detail, even in an area that would not be seen by anybody. Just that exquisite attention to detail and the art and design for its own sake. There's even a little trefoil, or a quatrefoil rather, right here, holding this sort of footrest to the side. Extraordinary attention to detail for its own sake, as I say. And then again in the ceiling, as Downing had said, the ceiling should be like a Gothic ceiling that you'd find in a cathedral, with ribs and these bosses, all here beautifully done. And we can see here in the spaces between the ribs, the quatrefoils, trefoils, and everything, the triangles, again, reiterating that sense of the triad, that sort of numerology, Gothic numerology. And then here we can see that Guidicini's work is absolutely exquisite, and he's created this sort of trompe-l'oeil, sort of wings here, if you like, almost like spandrels, with that little pointed arch and so on suggested there. Now there is evidence, and perhaps when this room gets to be restored, there does seem to be evidence that there was silver paint along these the tops of these ribs, which would have made these really sort of pop out and yet still have that depth with the brown paint beneath them. But again, it's a very subtle color scheme, of which I think Downing would have approved. And then the gasolier, which is at the center of the room. Again, it reiterates the design of the table, of the desk that Hertha had designed and built for Morse. We can see here the tracery that I had pointed out earlier. And here in the center of the gasolier, we see that same tracery. And again, columns rising up like a great pier in separating the nave from the aisles in a great cathedral. Again, extraordinary interconnectedness, integration of this theme that just reiterates and reiterates the integrity and unity of the room. The Gaselier is, we believe, an American design and manufacture, where many of the other Gaseliers in the house were done in England or France. And here we see the Gaselier in two different shots, just to see the overall effect. So one would have to look fairly closely to notice the tracery and the Gothic design, but it's there to be seen for those who wish to pay attention. It's a little bit clearer here, I think. And in this picture, you can see a suggestion of the ribbed embossed ceiling. There's this beautiful frieze here that snakes around the whole room. We see the top of the bookcase. We see the paneling above the bookcase still continues and reiterates that theme of the trefoiled windows, or it's almost like a clear story that would have been in the top level of the three tiers of a medieval Gothic cathedral. Quite extraordinary. And here is another picture of the library, again showing all the elements coming together beautifully. Of course, the carpet was not there at the time that Morse was there. That was laid later by the Libbys. So, but this integrated design is perfectly synchronized. Everything fits together, as we've seen throughout this talk, except for this interesting arch, which does not seem to be in any way, shape, or form Gothic. And that was not in the original design by Herta. The room was much smaller in the original design, but in the 1880s, the Morses pushed out this bay towards the driveway. And this solution was probably the easiest to make that transition from this area into the bay. Perhaps Morse didn't want a monastic cell-like space. He wanted more light and space. Who knows? But again, you have design that was shaped and adjusted for the needs of the resident of the house. And so to end this talk, I thought a parting word from A.W.N. Pugin, that great champion of Gothic revival, would be apt. And he said, "In pure architecture, the smallest details should have a meaning or serve a purpose." And I think there's just absolutely no doubt that Gustav Herta and Guidicini completely and utterly took that to the 10th degree and have produced another remarkable space for their client, Ruggles Morse.